Good evening and a very warm welcome, but socially distanced welcome, to our members and our guests. As we all digest the latest economic, political and public health developments in Malaysia, many of us are, unsurprisingly, wondering where all of this leaves the Malaysian economy for 2021 and beyond. Now, it seems that we've all learned that public crystal ball gazing, even for economists, can be a somewhat risky pastime. However, we hope that our guests this evening will indulge us a little and venture some of their opinions on what they think is in store for the Malaysian economy and how we can find a path to a solid recovery. So I'd like to first of all just introduce our guest this evening and your host. So Datuk Shahril Ridza Ridzuan, or Shahril, is the Managing Director of Khazanah National Berhad. He was formerly the Chief Executive Officer of EPF, and prior to that, he was a Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Investments. He's currently the Chairman of M&S Pte Limited and Iskandar Investment Berhad, and is a non-exec board member of Malaysian Aviation Berhad and Malaysian Airlines Berhad. During his tenure at EPF, he served as a non-exec board member of Media Prima Berhad, Malaysia Building Society Berhad, and Malaysian Resources Corporation, as well as IJN Holdings Sdn Berhad. Prior to joining EPF, he was the Managing Director of MRCB, where he was responsible for developing Kuala Lumpur Central into one of the main commercial centres in Malaysia. He was previously at PNB, where he was involved in the corporate recovery and credit restructuring following the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Shahril holds a Masters of Arts First Class from Cambridge University, where he did his undergrad, and the Bachelor of Civil Laws First Class from Oxford University, and has been called to the Malaysian Bar and the Bar of England and Wales. Our second guest is Dato Abdul Rahman Ahmad. He's the Group Chief Executive Officer of CIMB Group Holdings Berhad, CIMB, and the Chief Executive Officer of CIMB Bank Berhad, with effect from the 10th of June 2020. Prior to joining CIMB, he was the non-independent chairman of CIMB Derby Berhad and Valesto Energy Berhad. Dato Rahman has more than 20 years of leadership experience across multiple industries, where he held Chief Executive Officer positions in well-established organizations such as Malaysian Resources Corporation Berhad, Media Prima Berhad, Equity National Berhad, and PNB. Dato Abdul Rahman holds a Masters of Arts in Economics from Cambridge University. He's also a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales and the Malaysian Institute of Accountants. We were just saying earlier that both of them were at Cambridge together. So Datuk Shahril was at Christ College, Cambridge, and then he moved to the other side to Christchurch. And Dato Abdul Rahman was at Fitzwilliam in Cambridge. So they know each other very well. Darina Yusof joined Standard Chartered Bank Malaysia Berhad as the Country Chief Risk Officer in January 2019. A career banker, Darina has over 30 years experience in various areas of banking encompassing risk management, corporate finance and banking, SME lending and strategy. She currently leads a team of 20 plus risk specialists, from credit risk to operational risk to cybersecurity risk. Prior to this role, Darina was the Country Chief Risk Officer and Senior Credit Officer in Standard Chartered Bank Indonesia. Darina graduated with a BA Hons in Philosophy, Politics and Economics from Oxford University. She was at Somerville, a couple of years ahead of me. Apart from being a CFA charter holder, she also holds a cuisine certificate from Le Cordon Bleu in Malaysia. And I tell you, if she manages risk half as well as she cooks and bakes, I can tell you that Standard Chartered is in very fine hands at the moment. So with bankers, lawyers, and economists and PPEs in the room, I am sure that we will get some clarity and be able to make some sense and direction of where the Malaysian economy will be in 2021. So I'd like to pass over to Darina and our guests.
Thank you, Emma, for the kind introductions. A couple of short observations from me before we start. Firstly, I'm looking to challenge our speakers today, but any views expressed by me certainly is not taken to be representative of my day job as a risk manager for Standard Chartered Bank. Secondly, While politics and economics are undeniably intertwined, I would like, as far as possible, for our speakers keep on to economic. A starting point before I lay out any questions, I would like to give the opportunity to our speakers to share a little bit about their thoughts on today's topic, which is Malaysia's path to economic recovery. Shall we let Dato Abdul Rahman start first, please? Dato, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. First, thank you very much, Emma, for inviting me to this session tonight. It's always a pleasure to participate in an Oxbridge event. Thank you to Darina for doing the kind introduction, and for Datuk Shahril for allowing me to do the presentation, or basically of my talk first. Obviously, Datuk Shahril is my boss, so thanks for allowing me to start first. Yeah, I got about 5 slides just to do a quick, I guess, to set out the tone on our topic tonight, which is the Malaysia's path to economic recovery. Before I start, a similar caveat, what is presented today is more of a personal view rather than an official CIMB view. So let's begin. The first slide is generally, I think everybody is quite, cognizant on the fact that in terms of economic recovery, it will likely track in terms of the country ability to control COVID-19 outbreak. And I think the easiest illustration obviously is China, as we know that China had where it started, and but the economic recovery in China, even in 2020, is probably one of the few countries that actually had positive economic growth, simply because they were able to actually to control the COVID-19 outbreak. Next slide, please. For Malaysia, which our topic of discussion, generally, I think we expect that the stimulus program is currently helped to offset effectively the decline in the GDP growth. Government of Malaysia roughly, I think, are pumping about 305 billion. Oh, sorry, the stimulus package about 305 billion, but 250 of it is generally what we call other measures, like coming from EPF withdrawal, bank loan moratorium. The government direct intervention or injection is roughly around 50 billion. So in terms of GDP, it's quite substantial, and effectively it's been helping to actually offset, I guess, the GDP contraction that we've been facing. Next slide, please. So if you look at it in terms of the countries, all countries experience a contraction, apart from China, effectively, as we mentioned it, on a quarter-by-quarter basis. Most of us, the largest contraction was in the second quarter of 2020. They expect to basically to bounce back. And the forecast generally that most countries will bounce back to deliver positive growth in 2021. Malaysia itself, I think, Bank Negara numbers ranges between 6.5% to 7.5%. I think on the CIMB side, I think we are forecasting probably about 6% growth. But a lot of this assumption, I think, predates the current increase back of the COVID-19 that I think we are under currently. So I'm not quite sure. My own sense that effectively some of these bounce back number probably on the upside, and there is a significant risk of downside should we are not able to tackle effectively or bring back down the COVID-19 pandemic spread. But whatever it is, even if you use that kind of growth, next slide, please, we don't expect the GDP for countries to hit back the 2019 level until 2022. So I guess everybody's quite consistent in this. They expect effectively 2021, the economic growth will be positive, but in all likelihood, the output level of GDP probably will hit back to 2019 level in 2022. Next slide is, in terms of Malaysia's own recovery path, I have, and this is a personal belief or a personal view, my belief effectively Malaysia recovery, the outcome will be dependent on what I call the clashing of what I call a two-tier economy that that we are under. So if you look at the Malaysian currently, the positive part is that there is a commodities price inflation. We all know that palm oil effectively are growing. Price has increased to future prices probably in excess of 3,500 ringgit. So that effectively is doing positive. The medical manufacturing part of it is doing well. The E&E, effectively the E&E element of it is doing well, and there's a lot of liquidity. Most financial institution liquidity effectively has been very, very strong. Banks basically there, and demand on consumption for those that I think in terms of jobs have been quite positive. However, at the same time, we know that there is what I call the economic sectors that have been affected: international tourism, leisure, oil and gas are still stagnating. The commercial properties, we are facing a significant glut. There's impact on the retail side. And what balance it off, I think there's still what I call relatively high household debt. So the actual eventual pace or path of the economic recovery, in my mind, will be a clash between these two. And it's still a bit uncertain which basically will outweigh, whether the positive part of the economy will outweigh effectively the negative part or the other way around. But in my mind, the bigger issue of it is whether Malaysia is able to address our own structural challenges. So Malaysia is what I call, we face effectively the COVID, but even without the COVID, I think Malaysia is facing some structural challenges. And some of it is mainly our economy is still dominated by what I call legacy industry, plantation, oil and gas, a bit of E&E, which basically is growing, but property. So that part of it, I think, you're still what I call a traditional legacy focus economy. Secondly, I think the big issue is that Malaysia, if you study our productivity in the last 10 years, really have been stagnating. And a lot of it, my own belief is that Malaysia continues to be what I call a low-wage economy fueled by foreign labor. Because of that, there is a disincentive to invest in automation to increase productivity. Skill level in terms of education, I think is a big structural challenge effectively in Malaysia. Foreign and domestic investment, if you look at the number over the last 5 years, has been quite disappointing. A lot of it is being fueled by government investment. So that I think is a big issue. And last basically is linked to this issue about which I guess is caused by causing our productivity is that the lack of investment in terms of tech adoption and adopting the new technology going forward. So that's my perspective, I guess, in terms of the issue about Malaysia's path to economic recovery. As I said, it is on the short term will be a balance between the so-called positive part of the economy as well as the negative part of the economy. But the bigger, longer-term challenge is for Malaysia is, can we address our structural challenges? So I stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll probably take over here. Yes, no worries.
Yes.
So
See, I don't need to mediate. Go ahead.
So for me, I think there's a bit more pessimism, especially given I think how 2021 is starting out. I think Dato Rahman has shown in his slides. I think some of the projections, especially in relation to potential economic growth in Malaysia. But I think a lot of those projections were done without anticipating that we'd end up in another MCO. And I think quite clearly, this MCO will have an effect in terms of both the commercial recovery of industries, as well as on consumer confidence, which fuels aggregate demand as well. So we think basically that if you factor in a start-stop revitalization of the economy, and it's going to be very hard to see the economy progressing smoothly on a gradient in the absence of a mass vaccination program, then we think basically that trend growth for 2021 is likely to come probably lower than the original projection of 6%. And I think that's to be expected because you're seeing basically in other countries as well, other than some of the better success stories that Rahman mentioned, like China and Vietnam, that the start-stop is really panning out for 2021. And I think while we are all hoping for and anticipating basically a mass rollout of vaccines, the day-to-day reality basically, I think, is that the human condition basically finds it difficult to really live with the social constraints, as well as basically with the kind of restrictions that we put on ourselves to try and contain the virus. And what you're seeing basically is a gradual loosening or gradual tiring of society in terms of being able to stick to very strict SOPs for a very long time. So you're seeing basically a resurgence of the virus in multiple countries. And really, I think until we get to herd immunity via vaccination, we think basically that recovery essentially will be very much a very jagged path for 2021, going into 2022. And therefore, pushing back that recovery to 2019 GDP levels, probably closer to the end of 2022, and maybe even spilling over to 2023. And certainly, I think, if you look at the analysis that Dato Rahman did in relation to industries, it's quite clear that some of the industries that we Khazanah are invested in for strategic reasons will face a lot of difficulty in terms of recovery as well. Travel and anything related to travel, I think, will be one of those. It'll probably be one of the last to really recover, and therefore hospitality, tourism, anything that's associated with that, I think, will find it difficult. The COVID, I think, has also exposed what Rahman mentioned, which is basically underlying structural problems that have been inherent in Malaysia for quite some time, among which includes, for instance, far too much build out of commercial and retail space in the property market. And what COVID has shown basically is that that's really now unsustainable. We are in the midst of both a COVID economic crisis leading to economic contraction, and at the same time, basically a crisis in the property markets as a result of really too much oversupply of some sectors of property. And that's, I think, leading to a large overhang of dead assets and dead equity, really, that is really underutilized now in terms of investment. So if you actually look at some of the issues that Rahman raised, right, including the lack of productivity, it's actually turned Malaysia, even prior to COVID, into basically a poor choice or poor destination for international investors. A lack of productivity, declining perceptions of education standards, a lack of focus on technical and digital investments. And those have been structural issues which I think we've been struggling to turn around. And successive governments basically have been focused on trying to work on those and to try to manage those. But they are holding us back in terms of our economic potential, which is why we're seeing basically countries like Vietnam or Indonesia really starting to take off, fueled also by the fact that they have larger domestic economy and populations to sustain basically the growth of homegrown technology and homegrown apps and everything else. So what's the path for Malaysia? I think we have to swallow some of this hard medicine, right? It's bitter medicine in terms of refocusing our industries and our economy forwards, being brave enough to embrace digital technology and change, and really restructuring how our economy works as well. And over-dependence on cheap foreign labor is unsustainable in long term. And we need to think about how we can progress our industries upwards in terms of the technological value chain, and in terms of basically both products and services as well. We do have still some inherent advantages. Geographically, Malaysia is the center of Southeast Asia, and that bodes well basically for things like logistics, for being a hub in terms of hub and spoke manufacturing. So we do have natural advantages that we can take forward. Palm oil remains a huge mainstay of the economy, and a big beneficiary this year in terms of a shortage of production as well as better prices, and approaching now about 4,000 ringgit per metric ton. So a combination of all industries. I don't think we should give up on all industries. All industries are critical, I think, for the stability of the economy. And Malaysia is not a city-state like Singapore or Hong Kong. We have a rural economy that we need to take care of, and a rural population that needs to benefit basically from agriculture as well. But we do know basically that with increasing concentration of economic activity in key areas like the Klang Valley, Penang, Johor, those areas need to make better use of both capital as well as in terms of the education system needs to improve tremendously to get the next generation of workers ready for the future. I can go on a bit more, but I think probably best to halt for now and turn it back to Darina and start taking some questions, I think, at this point. Darina, over to you.
Thank you very much. You've certainly given, thank you, Dato Abdul Rahman and Datuk Shahril. You've certainly provided a lot of areas for us to explore. I would like to get deeper into some of your thoughts on the structural inefficiencies or legacy issues. And that, I think, takes me to where I'd like to go back a little bit. If we think back in 1991, 30 years ago, Tun Dr. Mahathir laid out his Wawasan 2020 or Vision 2020, and it called for Malaysia to achieve self-sustained industrial nation status by 2020. I think when we thought about what 2020 would look like, a year stuck indoors is not what we imagined. I took the time to go back and think, what were we looking for in 1991? And there were 9 strategic challenges, and I'd like to share with everybody the last 2 strategic challenges of Vision 2020 that focus on the economy. Number 8 was about ensuring an economically just society where there is fair and equitable distribution of wealth. And number 9 is about a prosperous society that is fully competitive, dynamic, robust, and resilient. Just rereading those again, I think they still remain relevant, but we haven't got there. Sitting in 2021, looking back as to what the intentions were under Vision 2020, what in your view, I will go with Dato Rahman first, are some of the success stories for Malaysia in getting towards Vision 2020? And what were some of the pitfalls, or could have done better gaps, or could have done better areas?
Thank you, Darina. So I think the positive part effectively is still the economic growth number, even though we didn't quite hit the developed economy target in 2020. If you look at the last 20 years, general economic growth on a per average basis is probably 5-6% per year. And that's pretty decent. I mean, in general, I think that is quite a commendable achievement in terms of making sure effectively that our economy continue to grow. Second part of it, I have to say, infrastructure development is probably one area that we have done. On the physical side, I think we all know how our country has really changed over the last 20 odd years. The highways, the buildings, basically the what I call the physical infrastructure. The third part of it, I think, the certain segment positive in terms of the industry that we talk about, the E&E industry. We are now global leader effectively in terms of medical manufacturing, in terms of the glove business. Prior to effectively the oil crisis, I think we developed a very, very robust, effectively, oil and gas industry. So I guess these are I call it the success part. On the what I call we could have done definitely better, apart from the structural issue that I mentioned, I think is the first thing is what you have actually touched on, which is what I call the inequality, or basically the growth. Malaysia is literally what I call, when I talk about two-tier economy, I think Malaysia has really then what I call a two, how to say, classes of society, but generally those well-educated, do well, certain part works in a very good sector. I think they are, and the entrepreneurs that's basically successful have really enjoyed, I call it basically a strong growth. Even if you look at pure wage, the higher level of the senior management compared to effectively to the lower level, and in fact to new grads, if you think about it, when Datuk Shahril and I joined, I think new grad salary was probably 2005 at that point of time already, 2000. But today, effectively, it's only probably the inflation over the last 20 years has been very, very marginal. Yet, effectively, on the senior management, what's capable, effectively, the wage inflation has been very, very, very significant. So to me, that like what you call the uneven benefits of effectively of over the last 20 years has really become very marked over the during this particular period. There's other disappointing part I have to say is education. We spend, as a percentage of GDP, 6 or 8%. I think last time if I remember the number, but we have to say, I think that the output in terms of the education has been disappointing.
Thank you, Dato. Dato Shahril, can I get your views on looking back on Vision 2020?
Yeah, I think in 1990, and I still remember when Vision 2020 was first expounded on, right? I think the population at that point in time was looking for something with a sufficient runway that we could work towards. But I think, as Rahman says, I think what we've seen essentially is that we've had a lot of hits and misses. Infrastructure has been good. Building out basically our data backbone has been good, although now basically I think we're lagging behind other countries. But if you recall, when we first started up building out our fiber and everything else, we were actually leaders in the region in terms of basically getting broadband out to people. But what has happened, I think, essentially is that there's not been enough focus on inequality as a major issue. And that inequality, to a certain sense, basically has now manifested itself in the kind of political upheaval and turmoil that you see, right? We always talk about politics essentially being a reflection of the economy. And I think what you've seen in Malaysia over the last 5-6 years really essentially is, apart from political scandals and all the rest, really is actually a manifestation of people's dissatisfaction on their economic status. And you can understand that because I think, as Rahman mentions, right, a lot of incomes have not grown with the economy. And there's been a disproportionate allocation of growth to holders and owners of capital versus basically to labor. So if you look at labor's share of GDP growth, basically has been quite dismal. Malaysia, I think, has one of the poorer manifestations basically of worker share of growth and of income, basically among countries of our level. So it's something we need to think about, right? It's one thing for the country itself to grow at 5 to 6% per annum, but who is actually benefiting from that growth? And I think basically that's why that message of 5 to 6% growth on a political level has been a bit of an issue because your people in the kampongs and your average guy in KL basically can't point to a 5 to 6% growth in their income or in their assets over the same period of time. So that's, I think, going to be a major issue. It's a major issue of inequality globally, but particularly in Malaysia, I think people feel that that particular aspect of Vision 2020 maybe has just not been achieved or not been fulfilled.
Thank you, Dato Shahril. I'd like to take you up on this issue of inequality. And I concur with you that beyond the headline GDP numbers, particularly today, the COVID pandemic has revealed deep-rooted divisions in our society, social divisions, technology divisions, and economic divisions. Those who have the means are able to ensure that they are able to adapt to lockdown measures quite rapidly. They are able to adjust and move forward to some extent. Those who haven't been able, who haven't had the means, have seen their income levels collapse, and their children fall further behind in education. What are your thoughts, Datuk Shahril, in terms of the path forward of an inclusive economic recovery for Malaysia?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the real challenge of the recovery because unfortunately, and we've seen this basically in the 2008 financial crisis and the 2002 dot-com crisis, right? When recoveries happen, you have that large spurt of growth, right? So you look at the GFC, for instance, right, from 2008 as the economy started to take off again and financial asset prices took off again. What happened basically was that all that growth was really concentrated at the top. And what you've seen during this COVID crisis is the same thing. I think the share of income and the share of wealth of the top 5% of the economy or the 5% of the population basically has actually increased as basically the wealth and the income of the bottom 50% has collapsed, right? So what I think will happen, and this is unfortunately a nature or a manifestation really of our capitalist market society, is that as growth returns, those people who already have the capital to deploy will take full advantage of that and capture the benefits of that growth, right? So what's the solution to that? The only solution to that really is actually government intervention, right? Either through means of taxation and redistribution, right? Or basically in ensuring a better level playing field to allow people who don't have the means to benefit from this to catch up and to really take more advantage of it. If you left it to the market will be hyper efficient. Those with capital will make a lot of money. Those who are already in a position to benefit from that growth and to exploit that growth will benefit, and they will exploit those who can't.
Dr.
So
Rahman, I'd like to
large-scale
come to
government
you.
intervention on policy is required. Sorry, Darina, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry. Dr. Rahman, I'd like to ask you your thoughts. You agree only government will help deal with the divisiveness. Are there any other paths open to us?
Sorry, Darina, maybe you can repeat. I lost you for about 10 seconds there.
Sure. Datuk Shahril suggests that only government intervention will be able to help with the divisiveness that we're seeing in our economies. Do you think that this is the only way forward in looking at economic equality and the social divisions we're seeing? Will only the government be able to help us and save us?
It's not only the government, but I think the fundamental I call it balancer of effectively of inequality in my mind comes from or focuses on education. So if you think about it, opportunities that Shahril, all of us basically got was through, I call it, the education effectively that that you actually have. So and the bigger issue over the last 20 years is that despite additional investment amount that we are putting on education, the output, unfortunately, and whether it's politics, whether it's that has got tangled into effectively the education, that I think has been the big causal impact of effectively inequality. Now, on the demand side, that's the supplies, right? On the demand side, effectively, there's not enough catalyst of new economy, etc., and all that. And I think is also the other challenge. And within the whole thing, I think we have an issue about what I call a low wage economy, and predominantly that's because we rely significantly on foreign labor, cheap foreign labor. So when your question is whether it's highly dependent on government because it's education, effectively is catalyzing what I call the productive growing economy, as well as effectively policy on labor, government really has an integral role to address it. Tough to actually to think about addressing this through pure market, non-governmental solutions. I hope that answers the question. Sorry.
Thank you. Dr. Shahril, when we think about the path forward, and you are certainly in the highest echelons of strategic decision-making and planning out, when you think about the drivers of Malaysia's economy in the medium term, apart from a mass vaccine program, what do you think will be critical? Is it the investment? Is it FDI? Domestic investment? Do we have to do more trade? Do people just have to do more consumption? Is it increased levels of employment? Or a switch to more digital economy? Or could it be that political and policy stability is really most pressing? Which of these drivers are you recommending?
So actually, if you look at a healthy economy, and this is the same principles as investing or asset allocation, right? What you actually want basically is an economy that's a lot more complex, which has basically a lot more diversification, so that we're not overly dependent on any particular one sector, or we have over exposure to any one risk in the economy, right? So the complexity of our economy needs to get better, and by that I mean really having more industries, more people in a varied number of manufacturing, service activities, and everything else. So all the items that you mentioned actually are important to that recovery path, right? You can't just depend on one item alone without causing essentially a risk factor in the economy in terms of overdependence. So as far as our economy is concerned, right, what's really relevant to me essentially on the long term, it's education, I think, as we all know. In the short term, it's governmental intervention on policy and fiscal stimulus. In the medium term, it's really about increasing complexity. And that means really opening the doors and encouraging investments across a multitude of industries and services. And that can be both domestic and foreign. I think what we need to maybe understand going forward really is that governments tend to make, fairly suboptimal choices when they try to pick and choose industries that will succeed. What government should really be focusing on really is creating an environment whereby essentially anyone is allowed to invest in anything and let the market then decide what works and what can succeed. But along the way, you create a more vibrant economy in terms of opportunities, options, optionality, as well as complexity, right? And that's really, I think, the right medium to long-term path forward.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on your point about short-term fiscal stimulus and flip that over to Dato Rahman, because in your presentation, Dato Rahman, you had a slide which you quickly slid over, which had Malaysia's fiscal policy almost 20% of GDP. This is, give or take, not far off from Singapore, which has a very high external dependency and about 4 times that of our peer countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. When we think about what's available to the government, interest rates are now at an all-time low. Banks are being forced into opt-out moratoriums of 6 to 12 months, and you will know this as a banker. Really, is there any economic powder left in the keg? Do they have anything left? Have all the tools been used?
Yeah, you're right. And I had a slide just now to say that roughly the economic stimulus was roughly about 300 billion. But to be fair to government, only about 50 billion is what I call direct government injection. The balance of it comes from EPF withdrawal, meaning people's money, and a significant portion of it is automatic loan moratorium that the government actually gave, and that's very significant in terms of the amount. Obviously, I think if things prolong, I think on the pure government side, even though I think GDP or negative deficit effectively is high, I think there's still some fiscal opportunities for government to actually to continue doing it. We have our self-imposed 65% that government debt should basically be about 65%. Roughly, there's no real hard reason why it needs to be at that particular level. And these current circumstances, if you believe, and I think we all do believe in the Keynesian economics, makes sense for government to continue to actually to pump in money. So I think there is still level or fiscal ability for the government to actually to do. However, my point is that I think government needs to actually to do it in what I call targeted and productive manner. The whole idea about blanket moratorium or the whole idea about give everybody effectively whether it's which subsidy, etc., and all that, you need to basically to make those injection to be productive. So in UK, for instance, basically you need to actually, or in Europe, whatever, you need to basically to put in the money, but you need to upscale. If you lost a job, basically to get it, you need to actually to sign up basically for some training program in terms of upskilling, etc., and all that. That is what I think Malaysia probably lacks. We like what I call a broad-based, politically sounds great, in terms of headlines, but it's not productive, and we are not being optimal. And I think you all know in terms of the loan moratorium issue, it has become a real political issue. But I see no reason why we need to basically to allow effectively automatic moratorium for people whose salary or livelihood hasn't been affected. So I think we need to be smarter and more targeted, because in order for, like you say, we need to, our resources are limited, rather than being what I call a broad-based approach.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. I'm going to go back to the questions now in the Q&A, which has been asked by our audience. The first one is for you, Datuk Shahril. Will the GLCs, the likes including of which is your old shop or the EPF, will they be expected to bring back money onshore by government of Malaysia to help bolster the rakyats in the country?
So right now, essentially, as far as Malaysia is concerned, we don't have a lack of liquidity. I think, as Rahman mentioned, there's more than enough domestic liquidity actually to meet our domestic requirements. And certainly there's scope for more pumping of domestic liquidity if and when required. I think what's important basically is that we recognize that for a lot of the savings institutions, right, whether it's EPF or PNB or even Khazanah, representing the savings of the government, we do need to have and continue to basically diversify our portfolios and basically continue to invest overseas because there are opportunities overseas that you just can't get in Malaysia. And the reality basically is that Malaysia is a very small economy in global terms. You need to have exposure to other things outside. Otherwise, actually, it's actually bad for the government, right? Putting all your eggs in one basket. So I think the government does recognize this to be fair to them. I think what you're seeing instead basically is making sure that continued domestic investment happens. And I think the institutions basically are looking at finding the right opportunities to keep investing in Malaysia, in addition to basically making our global investments.
Thank you, Datuk Shahril. Datuk Rahman, a question for you, and an area which CIMB has been spending time on, which is sustainability. To what extent can sustainability be incorporated to this path of economic recovery? Or is it just a luxury we simply cannot afford at the moment?
No, on the contrary, I think as a country, I think sustainability has to be incorporated in terms of our plan to economic part of the economic recovery. We all know pandemic effectively has shown how important it is for us to understand and address some of the what I call sustainability issue. So to me, effectively, we need as a country, we need to actually to be able to incorporate those. Especially if the government were to continue to think about fiscal stimulus or investment catalytic programs that can encourage investment. So I think we need to actually to do so. And in Malaysia, there's a lot of areas we could do to be aligned or be consistent effectively with that, with the investment in solar panels or encouraging people to actually to do that, or whether effectively in terms of environment, waste management, etc., and all that, water, which is basically a major issue. So to me, I think it's absolutely critical that we incorporate both as a country as well as effectively as an organization the sustainability element to be a core part of economic recovery.
Thank you, Datuk Rahman. Datuk Shahril, the next question is for you in terms of government debt constraint. Is the government debt a self-imposed limiting constraint on its stimulus packages? And to what extent will this fall away? And what are the risks that go with it? Particularly, it will be in terms of the sovereign ratings, given that Fitch has already downgraded Malaysia, and the other rating agencies are keeping a close eye. Can Malaysia afford to have more fiscal stimulus? And if it does so, at what cost?
Yeah, it's something which I think Rahman touched on earlier. We have a self-imposed limit as far as local debt raising is concerned. There's no reason why we can't move it up if we want to. So the issue is not so much a lack of liquidity or a lack of ability to raise the debt. The issue, I think, more revolves around the ability of the government to then balance the books going forward. So it's very important to remember basically that you do need eventually to settle those debts because Malaysia is not the reserve currency of the world, and therefore it is important that we think about these things. One of the ideas that potentially could be looked at essentially is you could do short-term stimulus by increasing fiscal spending and raising more debt in the short term, but with an implicit understanding that at some point in the future, taxes or a consumption tax will have to be introduced to pay it off. You can't let it keep floating. Otherwise, what ends up happening basically is like government budget, which is limited ultimately by revenue, tax revenue, right? We'll be spending more and more of its tax revenue on servicing the debt as opposed to actually developing the country, right? So at some point, the books will have to be balanced out. We can raise the money now. There's no issue about raising the money now. The issue really is about can we get the population to understand that it doesn't come without a cost, and that cost will be increased taxes in the future.
Dr. Rahman, can I have your views on the same topic about government debt and the risks that come with it?
Yeah, I fully agree with Shahril. The limits effectively is not about the self-imposed debt ceiling, but constitutionally, I think a lot of people know that we must balance our operating budget. We can borrow money to fund capex, but generally Malaysia has this rule that effectively we must self-balance in terms of the operating budget, which means, as Shahril said, if you start borrowing more and more, effectively going forward, if you are limited on the revenue side, then servicing of debt becomes a bigger and larger portion of the operating expense, and that becomes a real constraint, meaning you can't do more effectively on operating expenditure. So that I think is probably the bigger issue that Datuk Shahril said needs to basically to be mentioned. But liquidity is ample. And technically the government would be able to have the capacity to actually to grow. But I come back to my point, effectively it's not just about the money being spent, but it's all about being productive and optimal in where we are effectively spending. And that has never been a strong point of government, I guess, Malaysian government.
I want to ask a little bit of a light-hearted question. With Malaysian economy is big dependency on consumption, and Malaysians are renowned for our love of shopping. And with all the lockdowns, a lot of that shopping has had to move online. Can I ask you both, what was the last thing you bought online, or last thing you can remember buying online? And whether you are a contributor to this digital economy of shopping online? Dato Shahril.
Yeah, I think there's been a regular stream of delivery guys coming to the house. So what's the last thing about online? I just bought today basically a crash mat for the kids to use when they're doing the exercise at home. So yeah, you can buy everything online now. So interestingly enough, I think total retail spending basically has held up pretty well, but the shift has been away from brick and mortar to online. And that's really been the problem, I think, for traditional retail.
For me, Shahril is much more of an online shopper than I am. But I have to say, with this, I actually start shopping shirt. I never buy T-shirt online. I started doing that, so that was my last purchase, buying a simple a crew shirt. So
one of the questions we receive on our chat is if education is key, and both of you made reference to this, and there is a systemic failure or gap in our delivery of education, is it that might be a way forward?
Sorry, Darina. Sorry, Darina, you broke up there a bit. What was the last bit of your question? Oh, have we lost Darina?
Oh, we seem to have lost Darina. So the question was from Nina Disney, and she wanted to ask you, if education is key and there is a systematic failure, maybe public-private partnerships are actually the alternative way forward, particularly given the focus that we've had on inequality and the disruption to education, particularly for lower income groups.
Yeah, I think public-private partnerships can help to a certain extent, but there's a limit to what the private sector can do due to affordability and reach and distribution, right? Classic problems of economics. And that's why education, fundamentally, public education remains at the heart of any functioning economy. And that's why I think it's really important that we make sure that, as Rahman says, the money that we spend on education is used wisely in creating a competitive workforce. I think what COVID will show essentially is that vis-a-vis our competitor countries who have been able to handle COVID better and therefore had less impact on their education systems, you're going to have 1 or 2 years of our cohorts who are going to be less competitive compared to, for instance, children in China or Vietnam or Singapore. who've had really minimal disruption to their education, right? So that's going to be the long-term impact, I think, of COVID, which we're not going to see today. We're going to see 10, 15 years down the road in terms of impact to this current generation we're studying today.
Sorry about that, Emma. I pressed leave instead of chat. Big fingers. I do have a question, and we talk about we need all the resources we can to take our economic path forward. And I want to, and in my research, I did look up your respective websites. And the pandemic has revealed major disparity and that women experience COVID very differently, particularly in the work from home and study from home environment. Looking at your own organizations and thinking forward, what measures have been taken or need to be taken to support and empower women, not just in the day-to-day aspects, but also in developing desperately needed senior women leadership to make sure that all key topics arrive on the table. And your statistics are kind of not great, right? Khazanah has only 1 woman board member. You have 5 out of 16 senior women managers. CIMB has 4 out of 11 boards, so more board members, but only 2 out of 16 senior women managers. Is this good enough for what Malaysia needs for its economic path forward? And if it's not, what changes do you think will need to take place for your own organizations? Datuk Shahril first.
Yeah, so talking about Khazanah, I think we are actively recruiting for diversity. So that's not just about gender diversity, it's also about diversity on other things, right? Whether it's point of view, whether it's basically on education backgrounds, social backgrounds. But it is a challenge, mostly because I think, we live in a Malaysian society which still has some preconceived notions, really, of the roles of people in society. And that's a challenge that we need to overcome. It's not just about the organization itself, it's also about the society around it. Looking at Khazanah, and when I look at my leadership team, we have a lot of very good, diverse people on our team. Yes, it's not a perfect balance of men and women, but we'd like to think at the upper segments of management in Khazanah is really about meritocracy. And therefore, it's actually quite heartening to see that a lot of our female senior management have made it on their own merits, rather than because of a positive discrimination policy, right? So what we're doing is trying to use positive discrimination policy at the recruitment stage and at the early stage to get more people in, and then try to have a guided meritocracy to let basically people move out ranks. So that's how we're approaching it and approaching the issue.
Dato Rahman, your thoughts?
Yeah, so definitely we need to do better, and specifically at CIMB, you're right. I think on the board side, I think we are pretty decent, more than 30%. On the numbers, basically for pure my own direct report, yeah, absolutely, you have highlighted 2 out of 16. We need to do better than that. But the larger senior management group, and we define senior management group to be director, we call it director level and above. It's pretty decent. It's very good. It's 49%. Generally, and this is something that we report and quite proud of. So the key, I think, learning from, experiences, from PNB, even CIMB, the key out of it, is basically the last, I call it the last leg. How do we basically translate what I call the C-2, which are preponderantly significant in terms of women? How do we translate it to effectively for them to what I call the really C-1 level? I think a lot of that, we need to make additional investment in terms of what I call personal development, succession planning, and understanding further effectively the constraint that they actually women have that we need to actually to do so. But I'm very bullish about it. I really believe effectively Malaysia over time will really be able to hit what I call very, very strong women diversity index. In fact, if you look at the mass level, and you can see from the population of entrance to university in Malaysia, the ratio is probably like 60, if not 70, 30. So the issue effectively, what I call the supply side, is not the issue. It's really basically strong. It is that translating effectively, the last part of effectively what I call senior women leaders to become real, what we call the C and the C-1. And I think a lot of it we can do better. A lot of basically corporate Malaysia can do better. But it's all about giving fair chance, developing the succession planning properly, and allowing, I guess, flexibility, which is basically needed to actually to increase diversity.
Thank you, Rahman. Dato Rahman. It's now 8:56. I am mindful of time. Some closing words from you. Our topic remains Malaysia's path to economic recovery. Datuk Shahril, if you had to focus for the next 24 months to make sure that Malaysia gets on the right path, what would be your areas of focus and concern?
So the areas that Khazanah is working with government is to look at economic policy and stimulus policy. And I think that's going to be critical over the next 12 to 24 months as we think about how do we restart the economy. I think we have to accept the reality, which is basically that it will be a start-stop recovery. And that's likely to be the scenario for at least this year. And it will be uneven in terms of which industries will recover first. Right? What COVID has shown basically is that inherent structural problems have now been magnified, and those areas which were already structurally weak prior to coming into COVID, like commercial property, aviation, will continue to suffer until basically there's been, as in all things, a shakeout of supply that allows demand to essentially meet whatever supply that's left. So I think you'll see a combination of stimulus, a combination of consolidation, and unfortunately also restructurings, bankruptcies, which will be required to take supply out of the system.
Thank you, Datuk Shahril. I really appreciate your thoughts and sharing your views with us. Dato Abdul Rahman, last words from you, Dato Abdul Rahman.
Yeah, despite the challenges I think Malaysia faced that I've highlighted, I remain an eternal optimist about Malaysia. It's our country. I really believe in terms of the resiliency of all of us as a community. I think that's been demonstrated over and over again. And I think what we need effectively is the optimism to actually to invest. And despite the challenges and maybe the political uncertainty, put that aside, but as a society, as basically corporate Malaysia, or effectively even as individual, do things that we believe would help effectively our economy effectively to recover. So I personally believe in that resiliency, that innovation. I always believe Malaysian, when you put it into corner, will figure out a way of how to actually to make it work. And one thing that we all can do is, invest money where we think effectively is productive. And I believe effectively we do that, then the Malaysian economy will recover because of the strength of the resiliency and the innovation, or what we call our adaptability of our community.
Thank you, Rahman. Emma, I have kept strictly to the time. We are now at 8:58. I'm handing off back to you.
Okay, fantastic job. Thank you. Yeah, good to finish on a more positive, optimistic, resilient note. Thank you for all the great questions in the chat. I think we managed to kind of work through all of them, or the gist of them. And, I think the focus on inequality has been really interesting and, dare I say, quite refreshing. And maybe bizarrely, ironically, one medium and longer term benefit of this horrific crisis is that actually going forward, there will be a greater attention on this inequality, and maybe a keener sense of urgency that we actually need to address it. I mean, following the comments that you guys have been making. So thank you very much to Melissa and to Sean for our tech support, and thank you to Datuk Shahril, Dato Rahman's teams for helping us to fix up this event with everybody. Especially thank you to Darina for moderating, and thank you to Datuk Shahril, Dato Rahman. As two gentlemen at the heart of the Malaysian economy, it's been really fascinating to hear your views. I hope that we can see you at an in-person Oxbridge event before the year end. That should be our goal as well. In the meantime, we hope to see our members and our guests online next Wednesday for our US-Malaysia Relations webinar. Questions have been madly rewritten as we speak every day for that webinar. So we close. So Darina, Dato, thank you again. What a really interesting, fascinating evening. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Good night.